Throughout all of my schooling, there was one theme overarching all of Native American history. They were screwed. They cared about the environment, they showed kindness, they were egalitarian far ahead of anyone else, and then once Europeans showed up with all their guns, germs, and steel, they wrecked Native American society and wiped out their communities. I didn't question it much as I was going throughout the system, because Indian Americans ruled North America for hundreds of thousands of years. They were the first ones to live here, and now they're confined to reservations and a small minority in the American state. It was pretty clear they were genocided. But once you start researching the history of Indian Americans and European settlers, the David Goliath good-bad story starts to murky. Torture, burning, forced conversions were present long before Europeans and American Indians would in turn do many of those same things to European colonizers. I'm not trying to 180 the narrative here. Europeans weren't saints. But instead, I want to show you how this conflict was blurry, how cycles of war and violence led to settlers coming out on top, but then writing history in a way that favored their counterparts. I'm your host Dylan, and today I'm not trying to spread any ideology or destroy people's culture. Instead, I just want to shine truth on a topic that is largely one-sided in the present day by focusing on the stats, the data, and the testimony, while keeping my biases out as much as possible. First, I want to look at North America before Europeans, then the differing values between these two groups, then the cyclical violence, then the end, and you'll see what that section is all about. So what was the violence in pre-Columbian America? Very high is the answer. The school curriculum will focus on longhouses and hot spring baths and hunting buffaloes. These are all absolutely true. They were integral to American Indian life. But there's another side that is frequently missed in the school curriculum. The fact that raiding parties were as central, if not more central, to Indian life. Indian societies, despite what many will say, were not completely egalitarian. Men and women's power levels were much closer than in Europe, but gender roles were still prominent, with men taking on the hunting, fishing, and raiding roles. After a young Indian man went through the rites of passage and lessons from older men, and from older men to become a man themselves, the vast majority went on to become warriors. Through this, they would go on to join raiding parties. They would steal horses. They would take resources, even scalp heads. This wasn't just something to do to pass the time. It was a way you became respected and rose in leadership. And raids weren't uncommon either. They were constant, especially in the Great Plains tribes like the Comanche, especially after the Europeans introduced horses. Raids could happen multiple times a week during spring and summer seasons. These raids often ended with captives who may be adopted into the tribe, adoption commonly including brainwashing, or they would be put into slavery or torture and possibly a public execution. Captives could be scalped, they could be burned alive, they could lose limbs, or be part of a community beating where all the men in town got a little closer to each other with alcohol and taking turns punching some captives in the gut or head. This seems savage, maybe even barbaric, and to many Native American tribes, it was. Sometimes it's easy to forget, but it was only once Europeans showed up that there became a collective name and identity for people that would later be called American Indians. There are around 200 countries in the world depending on how you count, but 574 federally recognized tribes. And that number was likely much higher in the past before trains, assimilation, and 90% of the population dying from disease. So while many tribes did heavily practice rituals and raiding, there were many that opted for a more defensive approach to violence or even pacifism in extreme cases. But for many tribes, it was tradition and how both the torturer and the torturee showed bravery, courage, and honor. And you know what? We should look at the most controversial example of torture, scalping. The practice where you take a knife and slice off part of the head and most of the hair to use as a trophy. This trophy would then be used in dancing, display, or religious ceremonies to humiliate the other tribe and excite your own. In many tribes, the scalp of a woman or child was an even greater accomplishment because it showed you had the bravery and ability to go deep inside the enemy territory to the heart of the village. An important thing to note is that how scalping existed before Europeans showed up, with one of the largest examples being at Crow Creek in modern South Dakota, where nearly 500 villagers were massacred in the 1300s, 300 years before the first permanent European settlement, with remains showing that nearly all of them had been scalped. However, let's be fair here. Scalping dramatically increased after Europeans arrived. They did this through bounty programs like those found in New Amsterdam. Before being conquered by England, the governor, William Kieft, offered bounties to frontiersmen and soldiers for the scalps American Indians, who were considered enemies. This did transform the point of scalping. It was no longer about ritual, rite of passage, or bravery. Cold, hard economics. Now, there were more traditional forms of violence too. Raiding males who failed at their objective and were captured oftentimes ended up in public torture ceremonies. They would be sliced up, beaten, and burned alive. Jesuit missionaries said, quote, "They tore off strips of the flesh, burned them with red-hot irons, and made them suffer for many hours before death." The violence was cyclical, and one raid spurred another. A death demanded revenge, and the entire tribes got locked into blood feuds that lasted for generations. But what of the scale? How large were these really? Well, these conflicts were way bigger than most people realize. The Indian Wars with other tribes and Europeans weren't just a few decades of clashes. They lasted for centuries. One of the most famous inter-American Indian War was in the 1600s, where the Haudenosaunee, known colloquially as the Iroquois, fought the Beaver Wars, leading to them wiping out or pushing out dozens of tribes from the Great Lakes down to Ohio. They would go on to control land stretching from the eastern parts of New York up to Ontario, South Tennessee, and past Chicago. Now that would be one massive state in the US. Here's another thing to not get twisted. I'm not saying tribes were mindless killers. They had sophisticated societies, complex diplomacy, and incredible survival skills, but warfare was equally as important, and violence was not absent from these societies. Now, to be clear, the violence was widespread though. Now, to be clear, it wasn't universal. Some tribes were mostly peaceful at various points in time, like the Hopi of Arizona, who were literally called the peaceful people. But when Spain, France, and Britain arrived, they didn't walk into a peaceful Garden of Eden paradise, as much as LDS members wish Missouri was. They walked into a continent of warring nations. Each European power tried playing the game, arming certain tribes, making alliances, using them as buffers. So the wars didn't stop, they got bigger. And when new weapons, animals, and tactics were introduced, they were as important to Indian Americans to use on each other as they were Europeans for the many decades and centuries to follow. And before we move on to the next section, quickly, a tradition on this channel is that if you catch any mistake I make in this video, leave a comment down below and I'll correct myself in the pinned comment. I'm just a solo researcher here, so I'm sure there's plenty for you guys to find. Anyways, contrast this style of warfare with the one that Europeans had for centuries. Armies dressed different than civilians. There were war declarations, and civilians were not supposed to be included, even though in reality, they were often included in the fighting throughout Europe. These norms completely broke down on the frontier. The tactics of American Indians were different from those of Europeans in just about every way. Armies and civilians dressed the same. There were never war declarations, and civilians were often the prize of raiding and fighting, whether that be for killing, torturing, or assimilating. A group of raiders would often ride out at 3 a.m. to a local village, burn, raid, steal, kill for a few hours, then promptly vanish. These were shocking, horrifying to settlers on the frontier. Not because back in Europe, women, children, and civilians were broadly off limits. In the 30 Years' War, for example, 5 to 8 million civilians were killed when the total population was around 78 million on the continent. In some areas of Germany, over half the population died. So let's not get it twisted. Civilian deaths weren't shocking, but how quick, fast, small, and personal they felt, that was shocking. Of course, this went both ways. The idea of defending land to American Indians was an equally foreign concept. Land was just there. It wasn't owned and it wasn't fenced. There would be fights over which tribe and group had grazing rights, but not who could build a maize farm. Land was more like a subscription. You had the rights to an area of land, but you could never own it. Or how about the idea of surrendering? Indians didn't have a system for prisoners of war. You're supposed to feed prisoners and have them do some physical labor for you, but not torture or kill them. To Indian Americans, surrendering would just mean giving yourself up to death, torture or enslavement. Again, it's not like this system was very honorable in Europe. A surrendering army could easily just be killed, like in the siege of Wexford, where troops were in the works of surrender, but English troops found a way into the city through the back entrance and decided killing tens of thousands of civilians was far more efficient means than surrender. All these breakdowns in war styles made the usually offensive settlers useless against the American Indians. If you keep a tight formation of a couple hundred people in a forest area, you'd slowly get picked off without ever having a real chance to fire back. And if you ever did get a chance to fire back, they could easily split up and scatter into the surrounding forest, where they would likely never be found. Or even if the settlers did follow them, they would again have been put in a place where they could easily be picked off. Now, this event would usually only really happen in the eastern woodlands where, there was woods. There'd be a different experience against Great Plains tribes or the Colorado Mountain tribes. Nevertheless, settlers adapted to this new form of warfare. Those on the frontier formed ranging companies of small, fast units for quick response to any raids or violence. They weren't soldiers, they were normal, everyday settlers that just had some gun experience and a mission. And with the increasing support of the United States military, there was about to be a lot of bloodshed. The American Indian Wars lasted from 1776 to 1890, 114 years, almost as long as the 100 Years' War that was actually 116 years. A census looking at the data from 1789 to 1846 found that around 19,000 white settlers died and 30,000 Indians. That may not seem like a lot, and that's because it isn't. Most battles had less than 1,000 total combatants combined. Few reached over 3,000, but when the American Indian population was around 600,000 in 1800, a decline from 5 million in 1492, that was a lot. And by the way, the American Indian population only reached 5 million again in the 2000s. Keep in mind, these numbers are pretty speculative, with numbers ranging from 1 to 12 million in the population numbers from 1492. But man, when you look at that graph of the population over time, it really hurts. Of course, keeping in mind, much of that death was due to old world diseases being carried over to the new world. But of course, violence had a role to play too, and more importantly, the cyclical violence that I've been talking about. The catalyst would be white settlers coming in for land and resources, in the vast majority of cases on promised lands to Indians and past treaties. Don't worry, we'll talk about that later. This catalyst would then provoke American Indians to respond by stealing livestock or intimidating settlers to get them to leave. And to the settlers, this was theft or provocation, and to the tribes, it was trespass enforcement. And that's right, in most cases, violence was not the first thing. It came next. There would be some kind of spark, an isolated small event of violence that would lead to escalating violence. A nervous settler shoots a hunter, or a group of young Indian warriors acting against the wishes of their elders, raiding a remote farmstead, killing settlers in the process. And once blood was spilled, rumors would start. The craziest rumors, the most exaggerated, would be the ones that were spread the most, often leading to a vast exaggeration of the true event, and thus the retaliation would be escalated too. And because the federal and state governments had little control over what was happening at the frontier, and there was no shared court system between settlers and Indians, retaliation was local. If settlers were killed, a local militia would burn a nearby Indian village. If a hunter was shot, you'd bet there'd be a raiding party coming for the nearest homestead soon. These retaliations rarely targeted the actual perpetrators, and instead they targeted the most convenient members of the opposing group. This ensured that innocent people on both sides were personally invested in the revenge cycle. Once the news eventually reached the state and federal governments, which could be weeks after the first event, what actually sparked the violence didn't matter. The white settlers were always in the right. Federal troops would come in and engage in total war. They would burn winter food stores, killing horse herds, genociding buffaloes. Whatever it took to make the Indians surrender, they would do it. Oftentimes, American Indians would actually win. With the clever use of guerrilla tactics like striking supplies or attacking disconnected outposts, there were dozens of battles and mini-wars Indians won. But then there was the issue with peace. If the tribal group won, there would either be no technical end to the war, or a peace sign that was never meant to be real. Tribes could rarely get any real concessions out of the government because they lacked the manpower to hold and enforce their land claims. Now, that sounds bad, and it is. But if the tribe lost, they were dealt an even worse hand. Whatever was the agreed upon borders from the previous treaty was redrawn. In most cases, the tribal group would lose over 50 to 80% of the previous land. If the government had fought this tribe before, oftentimes they would lose all their land and be moved across the country to a reservation. This peace would only last for a short time. And if that wasn't the case, the peace would only last for a short time before a new spark would happen, a new retaliation, a new entrance by the government, a new treaty ceding more land to the United States. This cycle went on for over 100 years, and it's how the land owned by the US went from this to this, excluding the Mexican-American War. Indians were not without blame. Let me make that clear. Oftentimes, treaties were just signed by these tribal groups to regroup for the next raid. But these are quite clearly less than what the American government did. The US federal government negotiated over 500 treaties, and they broke every single one of them. The US government violated its duty under the Constitution to follow the treaties it signed over 500 times without barely any recourse or justice ever coming from the courts or Congress. The Chief Justice has made his decision. Now let him enforce it. However, it's clear that neither of the polarized narratives of Indian Americans hold true. This wasn't about a noble civilization defending against land-hungry, immoral whites. And it wasn't peaceful natives crushed by evil invaders. This wasn't about a savage civilization that needed to be defeated. And it wasn't about peaceful natives crushed by evil invaders. It was about two cultures and civilizations clashing into one another. And one with far more guns, germs, and steel came out on top. The clash of civilizations that played out was sustained by two groups telling themselves the same story. We're the victims, they're the savages, they started it, we're finishing it. The real hope of the story is that for the sake of human lives, we can leave behind these tribal habits of us versus them as we move on into the future. But what we definitely know is that the leaders of the world in the 20th century did not remove the violence and leave behind their old ways, as what Japan did in World War II was some of the most horrifying things humans have ever done. But if you ask an average person on the street, they wouldn't be able to tell you a thing about what Japan did. You can see all the terrible crimes against humanity Japan committed and why we've all forgotten about them right over here. And don't forget to leave echo chambers, don't break treaties, and think controversy. I'll catch you over in this video right here.